So everybody can hear me from speaking from here. Am I speaking loudly enough? There's a right guard here. This is obviously, I don't know if this is good. And there's a giant bottle of water. So everything a person can eat, I guess. Thank you very much. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله وبه نستعين والصلاة والسلام على سيد المرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Thank you very much for inviting me, and thanks to Mizan for organizing this. And it's kind of a long-standing ambition of mine, or hope of mine, to be invited to the UK to speak, because my mother did her PhD here in Cambridge, my grandmother did her PhD at Oxford, my aunt did her master's at Oxford, my sister did her undergraduate at St. Andrews, and my family has this long history of coming to the UK, and we have all sorts of Charles and Diana tea sets in our house, and biscuits and things like that, so we kind of live in this, I don't know, Anglo-American immigrants to America who live in the sort of cultural shade of the motherland, and yet I have only come here once or twice in my life and have never been to these places that where my family studied and that they respect so much. So to be invited to speak at British university is, I've always longed for this affirmation. So thank you very much for organizing everything. Mizan will probably be annoyed if I mention this, but I sort of disputed with him about the topic. And this is not going to be a good, I don't want you to take this as a non-endorsement of what I'm going to speak about, but I actually don't think the topic that I'm speaking about is the appropriate topic. I don't want you to take this the wrong way. What I mean to say is, when we study the way that Western scholars look at the Hadith tradition, I think that you can very easily fall into this maybe unproductive circle of looking at their methods and trying to, you say, I want to refute what they're saying about Hadith. But often, I think what you'll come up with eventually, or come to a certain realization, is that disagreements over the reliability of the Islamic tradition, Hadith being part of it, is not something that can be resolved through discussion or presentation of evidence, because it ultimately stems from different premises and assumptions, and that those assumptions cannot be reconciled without a deeper understanding of where they come from. And they may not be reconcilable ever, but the point is that you end up having a conversation which might never able to be actually taken anywhere. And so my real interest when I look at the topic of Western study of Islam is really to look at what the West is. What is the West? Where does it come from? What is the concept of, what is a Western perspective on anything? And where does that perspective come from? When Mizan and I were talking about this movie that came out about the origins of Islam, which I haven't seen because somehow these websites don't work in the United States, but looking at the images and the pictures and reading about it, where is this? Why is this person making a movie? Why is there this image of this British guy with a hat sitting and talking to Bedouins and going to the pyramids and things like that? Why is this somehow going to tell us about the origins of Islam? And why is he doing this? What is this? This is a long tradition. These images are all rooted in some discourse tradition about the West and uncovering the origins of religion and of other people's religion and of their own religion. And it's studying that universe that fascinates me. So actually, I had a whole set of slides shows about this, and then Mizan said, no, you have to talk about this issue of Orientalism and Hadith. I said, okay, I'll talk about that. But if somebody says, we really are sick of this topic, we don't want to talk about this, and we want you to do the other slides, I'll be happy. But I understand, I'm here to serve the desires and the wishes of the community here, so I won't object. I'll just say that I think that there's another conversation which is more important and more interesting, but I will be happy to do my best to answer these questions. And they are important questions. What I'm trying to say is I think that there's a bigger conversation behind them, which I'm sure we'll get into. So this is an image of Egypt from the 1920s. And I think the reason I have it up here is because this is really the time when a lot of these Orientalists, the first generation of really successful, thorough Orientalists, are writing about the Muslim tradition. And some of them are writing in Egypt. This is something that people don't know about, but in Egypt in the 1920s and 1930s, European scholars of Islam were put on when the Majma' al-Lugha al-Arabiyya, the Council of the Academy of the Arabic Language, was founded. A fourth of its seats were reserved for European scholars. This would not happen today. I mean, imagine having in Egypt, the Council of the Arabic Language or the study of Islam, and a fourth or a third or a fifth even of the members are European scholars who are not Muslim. This would be very inconceivable today. But Orientalists were, at the time, in the early 20th century, and even in the late 19th century, especially in India, they were really looked to by Muslim governments, by modernizing states like Egypt, like the British imperial authority in India, as people who were going to actually tell Muslims how to understand their religion. And that Muslims were going to listen to them. And some Muslims, at least, were out there saying, yes, we would like you to tell us about our religion. Now, there was a great protest about some of the people who were on this Arabic Language Academy in the 1930s when it was founded. Rashid Rida really objected to Event Sync, for example, being on the council, and eventually he was the invitation was rescinded for him because of some of the things he had written about Islam. But this is interesting. I was very surprised to find out that these generation of Orientalists that we speak about, sometimes very critically, and we talk about people like Goldziher and Event Sync and Lamens. I mean, they were, for many people, I wouldn't say a majority, but there were institutions and people in places like Egypt that really looked to them as authorities about Islam to tell Muslims about their religion. Okay. So, when we talk about the Western study of Hadith, we are talking about the application of a critical method to a scriptural tradition. And the handy term which we can use to describe this critical method is the historical critical method, or HCM. This is a very internally diverse method. It's more of a kind of toolkit, an approach. It's not a method that you would use, let's say, to prepare your taxes or something, where there's a very regimented system of you have to fill out a form or something like that. It's not a method in that sense. It's really an approach, a mindset, a set of tools, a set of assumptions. And this is something that is produced or that emerges in Western Europe, in Italy and France, later in Germany and Great Britain, from the 1300s until the 19th century. It's a long period of development. It's a product of the Western tradition. It's something that comes out of Western European Christian intellectual tradition from the Renaissance onward. And this, I can't stress this enough. People are not born, someone doesn't pop out of his or her mother's belly and look at a text and say, oh, I'm going to approach it from a historical critical method perspective, or from another perspective. People don't just look at religion or think about religion or think about text or think about the past or think about claims about the past in any way automatically. The way they think about these issues is conditioned by their cultural environment. And this is very important because for many people in the West, whatever that is, and for many Muslims who are confronted by the West, there's, I think, an assumption that this is just the way that people should think about religion or should think about history. and that there's something weird or wrong with Muslims that they think about it differently, and that Muslims have to justify why they think about history or religion in the way they do, or defend that. But it could just as easily be turned around. Why is it that, why is it that this fellow who made this movie about the origins of Islam, why is it that he thinks about the religion the way he does? Why is there some origins of Islam that's different than what Muslims think it is? Why did someone come up with this assumption? Why do you have to go and talk to Bedouins and put on a hat and go into the desert to try and find what the origins of Islam are? I mean, seems to me to be a very odd assumption to start with. So it's very important we start this discussion that the playing field be level, that we not start the discussion with the assumption that the way that quote-unquote Westerners think about religion is correct. Muslims have to justify why they think about the religion in a different way. These are different approaches, neither of which is necessarily correct. I mean, if you're a Martian and you're observing the Earth, there's no reason to think that the way Muslims think about religion or history is any more or less correct than the way Westerners do. They're just different approaches. In fact, one of them, the historical critical method approach, is much newer. Now, I'm just going to go through some very important principles. I would love to spend 5 hours just talking about the history of where these things come from and why they emerged and how the weird mixture of rediscovering Greek history and Roman literature and the Protestant Reformation and Aristotelian science, how this all, and discovering the New World and finding out that there are tribes in Brazil who have no idea what God is, or no Western Abrahamic notion of God is, how all of these things came together to create this approach. I would love to do that. I won't have time. One of the important principles that comes out of the emergence of the historical critical method is what's called the principle of analogy. This is very, very important. What this means is, basically, human society is always the same. Human society is always the same. Whether you're in Greece, in Athens in 400 BC, or Arabia in 600 BC, or China in 1000 BC, or England in the 1800s, people are always the same. And they are the same in a negative way. They are self-interested, they're greedy, they manipulate power, they are dishonest, they pursue their own agendas, they twist ideas and beliefs to meet these agendas. It's a cynical vision of humanity that is really, I think, based in the Greco-Roman historical tradition. Historians like Herodotus, Thucydides, later Roman historians like Polybius, who died around 110, 115 BC, Roman historian. And what they say is, a historian, and here I'm quoting Polybius in his History of the Roman Empire, a historian, or the history of Rome up to his time, remember he's writing 115, 120 BC, relatively early, is that a historian has to be ready to praise his enemies and criticize his friends, because nobody is always right and nobody is always wrong. This is very important. I know this sounds, well, that's so important about what Dr. Brown is saying. It's actually a very important principle. What it means is that there is no community or group of people or time that is perfect or golden or free from criticism or better than any other time. And the Greek and Greco-Roman view of history was a cyclical. There was no beginning of the world. There was no end of the world. There's no better time. There's no worse time. It's just a constant circle, circle, circle of fate. The circle of fate, literally. Rotem fortunae, the circle of fate. Going over, rota fortunae. Going over, around and around and around. Nothing changes. This is very important because when you're studying, if I decide I'm going to go and try and discover how Muslims were living or thinking in the year 700 in Damascus, I am going to assume that their world basically works according to the same rules as my world right now. Now there are differences. I can say, okay, When an Arab says, when an Arab says, I verily, this thing is worth a camel to me. I'm just making this up. And say, well, camels aren't very, very valuable today. What does this mean? He doesn't think he doesn't think this thing is important. No, maybe camels are very important to him. So he's saying this is extremely important to me. Right? So I'm not trying to say human beings are always the same in every sense, but adjusted for time and place, adjusted for idiom and language, adjusted for lifestyle, that person will be motivated by the same things that motivate me or anyone else. Is this clear? Now, this is very important because it's completely different than the way Muslims think about their history. Is every time and every place equal? Is there a time and a place that is treated differently in the way we think about it historically? Can anyone think of an example? The time of the Prophet and the companions. Exactly. The Prophet says that the best, Salam says the best generation is the one in which I was sent, then the one after, then the one after. And as later scholars, one scholar in the 1300s named al-Kirmani, who did a famous Sharh of Sahih al-Bukhari, he says, this was a time of the Prophet and the companions who was free of evil. Free of evil. And you can't look at it. You can't look at from the Sunni perspective. From the Sunni perspective, I acknowledge that there's Imami Shiite perspective, there's a Zaydi Shiite perspective, but from the Sunni perspective, you cannot talk about the companions of the Prophet in the same way that you speak about people today. The assumptions about how their community worked, about what motivated them, about their decisions are not the same. Another important principle is the principle of anachronism. Anachronism. An anachronism is something that is out of place in time. It is out of place in time. So, for example, if I said, I'm in England, so I'll use Robin Hood as an example. Robin Hood, I find a text where Robin Hood is using a musket. This obviously is not a real, this is a made-up story because Robin Hood, at least to the extent that we know who this person was and when he lived before the widespread use of gunpowder and the development of muskets. This, if I see a story where verily, Robin Hood did raise his musket and shoot and accidentally shot Little John in the leg. Okay? This text is made up because Robin Hood did not have a musket. This is an anachronism. Now, and this again is an approach that goes back all the way. You can see Greek and Roman historians using this tool to try and pick out things in a historical account that can't be true, that cannot be true. This can't be true because this didn't exist at the time, or this wasn't spoken about at the time. And this is a very important tool that gets revived in... What's wrong? Oh, it gets revived in the Renaissance. It becomes a very important tool in Western historical critical method. This is very different from the Islamic tradition. Why might this be different? If we come across a report in which the Prophet supposedly says that the Qadariya are the Zoroastrians, the Majus of my community. There is no group called the Qadariya at the time of the Prophet. So if you're someone who is a Western historian, doesn't believe that Muhammad had any knowledge of the future or anything like that, or any access to divine revelation, this is obviously made up because later there's a group called the Qadariya, and it didn't exist at the time of the Prophet. This was obviously made up later to talk about the Qadariya. Well, if you're a Muslim and you believe that the Prophet could have access to the knowledge of the unseen, that God could inform him about something, then it's distinctly possible that he could predict the future. So this tool doesn't work. It doesn't work when you talk about the Prophet. it can work in other situations, but not when you talk about someone who has access to Hadith. Another important principle of dissimilarity. This term, I think actually the actual person I've seen using this technical term is Bart Ehrman, University of North Carolina. But this is a principle that even when it's not discussed as a technical term, is very important. And it is the idea that when you're looking at historical source, if something appears that seems to go against the interest of the writer or against the interest of the party to whom the historian belongs, it's probably true. So, why? Because why would the person make it up? Why would the person make, if the assumption is that people are sort of nasty and we're all very cynical about everybody and they're always forging history to make themselves look good and make their party look better, if they include a report that reflects badly on them, well, it's probably accurate, because why would they make it up? And this principle was discussed at length by an early Enlightenment scholar named Jacob Perizonius. I think he was Dutch, as an attempt to convince skeptics at the time, scholars who were very skeptical about our ability to construct the past, to reconstruct history, that he was saying this is actually a tool we can use to determine fact in ancient historical sources, or at least to weed out fiction. Yes?
How about you do the fact that some people might treat the story to with that reputation, i.e. you're saying that why would they make up something bad against them, maybe to win you over that I'm not saying that there are things that I may lie about later.
Yeah, this is something that you would, the question is, well, maybe they're including bad things enough bad things to make you believe they're reliable. This is a very cynical approach. and if someone's trying to do that, they may succeed. One of the things that historical critical method tends to do is to focus on something called the principle of verisimilitude. So when Western scholars criticize hadiths, oftentimes what they say is, you have a hadith, I was sitting with the Prophet and I remember it was after this battle and we were coming back from this raid. And this is all extraneous information. This is included to give it a sense of reality. So, for example, if I'm telling a story, I said, yesterday I came into the airport and, the hallways were so long and I was walking and there was a poster of an Olympic swimmer and there was I looked out in that runway and there was all these airplanes, and then I got to the immigration, to customs, and they asked me questions. None of that information is important. Why did I do that? Because life is more interesting when we include details and stories. But you could also say he was including that just to create this sense of reality. When a writer describes how they feel in a fictional account or in recollection when they're writing their autobiography, when they talk about where they lived and what the room was like that they lived in, why are they doing this? They're trying to recreate something for you. So the interesting thing, and this really gets into this question of, what I'll talk about now, default skepticism. There's no reason why providing detail should be an indication that I'm trying to mislead you. I'm simply trying to recreate something for you. Or maybe jog my own memory, to relive a moment in the past. But as a more cynical approach is, no, you're trying to, this is created to, this is included to create an image of verisimilitude. Okay, or create verisimilitude. And I think so these three important critical tools in historical critical method, they are accompanied by important themes in approach. One of them is a default skepticism and doubt towards texts. This is very important. What does critical mean? What does the word critical mean? when you read historians like Lord Acton talking about what a historian does, a historian is critical. It means when he or she comes across a source, he does not take it at face value. He inquires as to what really happened, what's really going on behind the source. The assumption is that a report about the past needs to be investigated. Is it correct? Now, it's very important. Muslim scholars are also skeptical of reports. They're also skeptical of reports. But there's degrees of skepticism. When you, and if you know, when Muslim scholars present hadiths, and this is something that's somewhat controversial, some people might disagree with me. You know, in general, Muslim scholars would say that you can't attribute something to the Prophet, you cannot attribute something to the Prophet without providing some evidence for it. But actually, in reality, when you look at how hadiths are used in law, or especially in preaching, or in Sufism, or in ethics, or just in daily life, we almost never inquire as to the authenticity of these reports. And you know, someone cites it's in Sunan Ibn Majah or Sunan Tirmidhi. Sunan Ibn Majah is full, up to a quarter of it is unreliable hadiths. Tirmidhi has many, many weak hadiths in it. That the Tirmidhi himself says this is a weak hadith, this is an unreliable hadith. He himself acknowledges this. And nobody goes and looks that up. Now, I don't mean to say that people in the West are critical and Muslims are not critical. People are critical about different things. Every day when you go to school in the morning, and you pick up the bus schedule, you don't say, is this accurate? Where did this come from? Who wrote this? I need to research this. It's a bus schedule, for God's sake, and it's put out by the municipal authority or something, and there's no reason to lie. Now, there could be, conceivably, some culture that has inured itself to extreme skepticism towards municipal bus schedules. And they will not pick up a municipal bus schedule and look at it without verifying this information. And different cultures are going to, at different times, are going to place different value on affirmation or investigation of the truth of a certain kind of source. And for Muslims, right? If you go to Egypt or you go to Delhi and you walk into a mosque and someone, the khatib gets up and gives a khutbah and tells you hadiths, the assumption is that these are things the Prophet said. Okay? And sometimes that might be an accurate assumption. Sometimes it's not an accurate assumption. And you have many instances from Ibn al-Jawzi in the 1100s, to Yusuf al-Qaradawi in the present time, talking about how they're sitting listening to a khutbah and every single hadith that the khatib uses is forged. Okay? This happens. But the assumption is that this is not the case. And there are many times, coming from the United States, I can tell you, Americans are incredibly ignorant of their history. And they'll sit there listening to some member of Congress giving a speech, or a president giving a talk, or some historian, or watching a movie about John Adams or something like that, and there'll be all this utter nonsense, historical nonsense. It's not true, but no one will be skeptical of it, because the assumption is that this material is true. Especially if, George Washington was really great, and John Adams was wonderful, and no one's going to go and say, well, is this really true? Is he really a good guy? Did he really say this? This is not something that is an area of skepticism to be indulged in. If someone comes up and starts talking about how Muslims are good or Islam is wonderful, then suddenly everyone gets very skeptical. So people have different triggers for skepticism, yes.
But isn't there an underlying assumption that people take authenticity with what you're saying?
Yes, this is an important, your statement about the author or the issuer of a speech is important. The speaker is important.
Because if they take the hadith from a scholar they don't trust, they will always trust it. They don't take the same.
Who's a scholar? But who's a scholar you don't trust? I mean, do people not trust? I'm just saying, regular Muslim Joe who's not coming to this class. Yes, no, like Ibn al-Jawzi says, العالم عند العامة من صعد المنبر. The scholar, according to the masses, is the guy who gets up on the minbar. What he says is gospel, to mix religious metaphors. So this is important. And by the way, this is not. We're not sitting here and saying Muslims have all these problems. And again, this is the trap we don't want to fall into. That somehow Muslims have this weird, cultish view of their religious tradition. And why don't they just get with the program and understand that they need to be critical like Western people? Because I can't tell you how many times I'm sitting there listening to the radio in the United States, to good radio channels like NPR, National Public Radio, and they just say, when they're talking about the Middle East, it's utter nonsense. And you can't, people will get up and no one will even correct gross errors that are made. I just remember the Muslim Brotherhood assassinated Sadat. This is one. I was sitting there listening to this, trying to call in, and but this is nonsense. This is not accurate. Why is there 3 people on the panel who are all supposed to be experts in the Middle East? No one said this is not accurate. Because it's just not something that people care about. Okay. So the approach of the Western historical critical method is that when you're talking about the past, you are automatically skeptical. And again, I want to stress, not everything about the past. Certain things. When you're talking about religious traditions, when you're talking about orthodoxies, when you're talking about other traditions, when you're talking about your own things that are important to you, to your polity, to your identity, you're going to be less skeptical. You had a question?
So does this skepticism apply to other historians?
To what?
To other historians.
Non-Western historians, you mean? I'll get to this. This is an important difference because when you look at when a Muslim scholar is studying Hadith, for example, or studying history, I'll speak mostly about Hadith. When a Hadith critic is looking at the past, and I think there's a very good something like Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal is a very good example. The Musnad of Ahmad ibn Hanbal contains many weak hadiths. There's a debate about whether or not it contains weak hadiths or weak and forged hadiths. And Hanbalis have debated this amongst themselves, and non-Hanbalis have debated this amongst themselves. I think personally that there's good evidence that there's forged hadiths in the Musnad. But other scholars, Imam Suyuti, Shah Wali Allah Dehlawi, says everything in the Musnad has an asl, has some basis from the Prophet. Suyuti says everything in it is maqbool. It's accepted in some way or another. Whether in law or in ethics or in something, it's accepted. So anytime somebody comes to you with a hadith from Musnad Ahmad, in theory, according to these scholars, this is true in some way. This hadith is true in some way. And you'll see, many times, I don't need to explain this to you because you're Muslims and you've come across this, how many times you see a sign in the masjid or something where it gives you a hadith and it just says Musnad Ahmad. It doesn't explain where it comes from. And the assumption is that it's accurate. Because I think for Muslim scholars, in the past and today, if the default assumption with an attribution to the Prophet ﷺ is that it's authentic, and that it should move you in some way. If it says, you see a hadith that says, oh believers, go and sell your houses and give all the money to the nearest stranger. I'm probably going to investigate that before I decide to sell my house and give the money to the nearest stranger. I think this would be a good approach to life. If it says, you should be kind to your mother next time you see her, okay, I already know I have to be good to my mother. It's established in the religion. So is it really going to, am I going to be very skeptical about this or critical? No. But in theory, if we really were to, I think, try to live the ethos of how we should, as Muslims, think about hadiths, which is you don't lie about the Prophet of God. You cannot lie about the Prophet of God.
We should be very skeptical at any time we attribute something to him. So Muslim scholars, sometimes they can be very critical, but the default assumption, I think in general, is that attributions, all things being equal, attributions to the Prophet are believed. And people can be free to disagree with me and we can discuss it. Okay. Another very important point, suspicion of orthodox narratives. That orthodoxy is suspicious. The official narrative of religion deserves to be doubted and is probably not true. And we have to think about why this is. Why does the Western scholars writing about religion in the late 1700s, or about the Bible in the 1800s, or about Christianity in the 20th century, why did they have this assumption that orthodoxies are constructed? They are built. They are not the original representations of the religion. Why do they have this suspicion? Because this is what they discovered about Christianity. And we can go, I would love to go into the history of how this discovery is made and built on. But they discover that, or partially through reconstruction of early text, partially through a kind of reimagination of what they think Jesus originally taught versus what the religion became, partially through the discovery of new texts, they conclude that what becomes Orthodox Christianity, either Catholic or Protestant, or sort of proto-Orthodoxy, which becomes Catholicism in the 400s and 500s of the Common Era, that this is a later development, and that there was something else before it that was different. And at least if you think about, if you have this obsession with origins, if you believe that originally what people understood as the religion was the true version, as this fellow who did this movie about Islam believes, apparently. Having not seen the movie, I can't be too specific or too critical. For all I know, it's a wonderful movie. The assumption that the original version is the true version, this is also not necessarily correct. I mean, this is not, there's no reason why that's true, necessarily. If you believe that a religion is defined by a body, like the church, or by the ummah as a whole, as time goes on, it constantly speaks and defines a religion for itself, then the original version is not necessarily the correct one. If it changed, those changes are not necessarily illegitimate. But it's this belief that orthodox narratives, orthodoxies are constructed, and that they are not the original, correct, true message brought by either a historical figure or a prophetic figure. This is also an important theme in historical critical method. Finally, and I've gone probably on way too long about this, but the belief that scholarly investigation can uncover this true history. That by using our minds, using our critical faculties, applying this method, we can actually uncover the truth of the past. And if we can't uncover it, then we'll come and say, you know what, we can't figure this out, but we certainly know what you think, what the orthodox narrative is wrong, what you've been told is wrong. We can't necessarily tell you what's right, but we know that what you've been told is incorrect. And if we're feeling optimistic, we can go back and uncover the real origins of something. And then you have lots of Discovery Channel documentaries coming out of this belief, yes?
Would you say that suspicion of orthodox narrative is perhaps similar to the way like Salafi schools also are in
Is this similar to the way Salafis think about? I think that there is a similarity, but it's not structurally determined. It's a similarity that's just coincidence. So Salafis would look at, let's say, the way that Islam is understood in the year 1400 in Damascus, with madhabs, rigid people following certain schools of law, like a guild, Sufi practices, and go visiting graves of saints is very important religious practice. They're engaging in speculative theology, and this is important to them too. They would say, these are all constructions that are not originally part of their religion. as understood by the Prophet and the companions. But they wouldn't, I don't think that they would automatically look at any expression of religion and assume it's illegitimate or assume it's constructed and it has to be, some origin has to be determined. They're concerned only with Islamic origins, and if they didn't feel that some practice was illegitimate or was imported or lacked roots in the early period, they wouldn't be skeptical of it. And there's lots of orthodoxies, for example, that Salafis completely buy into. The idea of the rightly guided caliphs. The idea of the Salaf to be, the idea of the Salaf is an orthodoxy. The idea that somehow the early Islamic period deserves to be followed and is more correct or rightly guided than what happens later. This is an arbitrary distinction. I'm not trying to say it's an incorrect distinction. What I'm trying to say is that you don't walk into a room and knowing nothing about Islam and understand automatically that the first 3 generations of Muslims are different than everyone else. This is something that you buy into as an orthodoxy. Does that answer your question? Okay. Where's Mizan? Someone should just, either hit me on the head with something when I've gone on for too long, or tell me when this session ends. Otherwise, I'll just speak endlessly. So I think. Okay. So let's talk about Orientalism. Finally, at long last. Let's speak about basically Western scholars start studying Islam really seriously in the late 1600s and early 1700s. The Quran gets translated into Latin, really bad translation in 1142 by Robert of Ketton. It's very difficult to understand. It's translated into French in the 1600s, into English in the 1700s. It's really, I think, in the 1700s that you start getting Western scholars who have a very good understanding of Islam. Before that, they really do not understand anything about the Quran. They don't understand anything about the Prophet. They don't understand anything about Islamic law. They basically, it's essentially polemics. It's just anything bad you can say about the Prophet or about Islam, you'll find it in books, and it has no relation to reality. The Prophet started out as a cardinal in Rome, and he did realize that he wasn't going to become a senior cardinal, so he goes to the desert, and he starts his religion. Stuff that is just really distant from reality, even if you're not Muslim. What happens in the 1700s, you start getting translations of this sort of general Islamic histories, like the Tarikh of Abu al-Fida. Gets translated into Latin, good Quran translations. And by the late 1700s, you have scholars like Edward Gibbon, the famous British historian of the Roman Empire, who died in 1794. His section in his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire on Islam is excellent. It's better than a lot of stuff that's written today. I was reading it, I was just stunned at how much this fellow knew. He knows about, the different Hadith collections, he knows that there's Sahih al-Bukhari, he knows that there's Naskh, he knows abrogation, he knows about the Prophet's wives, he knows about the different Hadiths that talk about the rewards that await people in heaven. He knows a tremendous amount. And this is a qualitative difference between his work and 100 years earlier. He's not Muslim. He doesn't believe in the Prophet's message. He believes the Prophet's ultimately an imposter. But it's really, you start seeing really an influx of good knowledge and awareness about Islam. And in the 1800s, even more. Now, Western Europeans start really learning about the Muslim world through 3 main routes. 2 of them are directly related to colonialism. In fact, you could say 4 main routes, really. One is the British East India Company's attempt to understand Islamic law, Mughal court records, Indian history, because they are now ruling by 1815, 1816. The majority of the subcontinent is actually being administered by British authorities. They are administering Sharia courts. using Anglo-Mohammedan law. They have to translate books of Islamic law. By the way, they're doing exactly the same thing with non-Islamic religious traditions in India as well. Another way is the European study of the Ottoman Empire, because of the European diplomatic efforts to understand, infiltrate, deal with Ottoman power in the Mediterranean world, in the 1800s especially. Another way one could say is actually the Dutch study of Islam in Southeast Asia, because Southeast Asia really becomes a giant coffee plantation for the Dutch, rubber and coffee. And there's tremendous study of Islamic law as understood in what's now Malaysia and Indonesia by the Dutch. The last route, which is the one we'll be talking about specifically because it deals with things like Hadith and the Quran, early Islamic history, is an extension of biblical studies. Western study of Islamic theology and Hadith is a direct extension of this study of the Bible. The earliest figures in the Orientalist tradition in Europe are German scholars like Julius Wellhausen, who write very important books about the study of the historical critical study of the Bible, and then they say, hey, if I really want to understand the lifestyle of the tribes of Israel, what better way than to go and look at Bedouins nowadays, in the late 1800s, and see how they're living? And then they start studying Arabs, and they start studying the Arabic tradition, they start studying the Islamic tradition, and their study of Hadith and the Quran is just, all it is a transposition of the historical critical study of the Bible onto the Islamic tradition. The assumption is, we did this with the Bible on the Christian tradition, now let's just take it and apply it to the Islamic tradition, which they assume will yield exactly the same results. William Muir is a great example of a Indian or a British East India Company functionary in South Asia. He was a major, actually a very important person in the East India Company in the mid 19th century. He was actually in the Agra fort during the rebellion of 1857. And he was sort of sending intelligence reports. He was a very important person in the East India Company and then in the post-1857 administration. He's also one of the most important historians of early Islam. He writes very influential study of the life of the Prophet. And in it you see some themes that will repeat themselves over and over again in the Western study of Hadith. That Hadiths are made up. They're made up to glorify the Prophet. They're made up to promote certain religious agendas, orthodox religious agendas. And a very important point he makes is that Muslims only look at the transmission of hadiths. They don't look at the contents of the hadiths when they're criticizing them to see if they're authentic or not. And that's why they don't see that there's all these anachronisms. They don't see that hadiths say things that are plainly crazy and scientifically inaccurate. From his perspective. It's important to say that. Another, and I think maybe the most important person in the Western study of Islam and of Hadith is Ignaz Goldziher, who's a Jewish Hungarian, or a Hungarian Jew at the time is probably the better way to identify him. And he actually goes and studies in Al-Azhar. This is a picture of Azhar in the 1920s, the Azhar courtyard. He goes and studies in Al-Azhar, and he knows obviously Hebrew very well, and he comes out of the German academic tradition, so very well versed in Latin and Greek and Hebrew and Syriac and everything. He knows Arabic very well. He goes and he studies in Al-Azhar, and you can see this in his work actually. He's sort of the first case of a Western scholar who goes benefits from Muslim scholars, comes back and doesn't give them credit, which is, I have to say, I give them credit. If I'm going to say one good thing about myself today, I will say that I give credit where it's due, and I freely admit that anything I've accomplished in my work is completely due to my teachers in Egypt and in other countries. I feel like I'm a translator of their work more than an independent scholar. And you see things in Goldzier's work that I haven't seen written anywhere. I have not seen them in any written Islamic book, but they're like Azhar traditions. They're, that's Ijma' al-Rukn al-Rakin yastanid ilayhi ad-din. That Ijma' is the firm column on which the religion rests. And he says in one of his books that Ijma' is the bedrock on which the Church of Islam is founded. I feel like this is something he heard and kind of translated. That's just my opinion. I have no proof for that. Anyway, his work on early Islam is amongst the best. I mean, he really knows what he's talking about. Nowadays, you see a lot of people writing about early Islam who have no idea what they're talking about, and have nasty agendas or something. But he had his biases, but he was a very good scholar, very thorough. What his argument was, again, the assumption is that orthodoxy is construction, hadiths are made up, and his argument is that hadiths don't tell us about the Prophet's life. They are a reflection of the community's will, the Muslim community's will, and what the history they want to construct for themselves. How does he know this? Because of anachronism. So if you have hadiths that talk about, there will come a time when, there will be black banners that will come from the east, from Khorasan, and you should join this army because this is the army of the Mahdi. So, well, this is clearly made up during the Abbasid revolution because the Abbasids had black banners and they were based in Khorasan, and they made up as propaganda to get people to join their causes. If you find a hadith that says that Sa'id man junnib al-fitan, that the happy person is the one who doesn't get involved in any kind of civil strife, he doesn't get involved in politics, well, this is clearly concocted by Muslims during the Abbasid period when they're trying to basically get everybody to calm down and not get involved in political strife anymore. Or if you find a hadith that says that Ali is to me what Aaron was to Moses, well, this was clearly made up by Shiites in their attempt to convince others that Ali should be, and the family of the Prophet should lead. And another hadith that says that, Muawiyah it's as if he was, or another example, that the Prophet inquired after Muawiyah and he wasn't there, and then he came later and he said, I was sitting beneath the throne of God. Okay, this is clearly made up by pro-Umayyad forces to legitimize the figure of Muawiyah. So he looks at, if you, in theory, the Prophet could have said all these things. If you believe the Prophet knows the future, he could have said all this, and this could all be completely accurate. But because the assumption is that he doesn't know, because the assumption is that people are making this up to construct an orthodoxy, determining what interests these various hadiths serve tells you when they were made up and by whom. Is that clear? This is Goldzier's argument. So there's hadiths that are made up to shore up Umayyad legitimacy, and that's where you get a lot of the political hadiths. The law, hadiths of law, Goldzier says, were made up during the Abbasid period, from the mid-700s to the mid-800s, because the Abbasids decided that they wanted to rule sort of with this position of Islamic legitimacy as people who were going to bring back the Sunnah of the Prophet. And they have to figure out how to provide some Islam for people to follow. And they just make up, they support hadith scholars, and these hadith scholars just make up all these hadiths to create a legal code. The people of Ra'i, the sort of the Hanafi school more, he says, they just took the existing provincial laws and made them Islamic. He says that they at least were creative, but not dishonest. The Hadith scholars were dishonest because they attributed all this stuff to the Prophet. So kind of the general bodies of Hadith that we find in Hadith books that are used in fiqh and theology were created, in his opinion, during the early Abbasid period. You had a question?
Sorry, it was just a quick question about regards to when these hadiths pop up. Say, for example, the hadith about the black banner. It was never heard during the times of the Umayyad, and Sunni appeared during the Abbasid. We could assume that it was forged, or is there one way of looking at it? When these hadiths pop up in narration?
Well, I'll speak about that right now. Because you have to, unless you happen to have lived throughout the Abbasid and Umayyad period, which I doubt you did, unless you're an immortal and we're in Highlander or something like that. No one even watches these movies anymore. Yeah, I used to love these movies when I was a kid. So the point is, we don't know that. How do you figure out when a hadith popped up? And that's where we get to the next figure, which is Joseph Schacht, who's a German scholar. Very interesting figure. He's a German scholar, but he leaves Germany, I think right before World War II. And not very enamored with the direction in which his country was going. And he moved to England. And eventually to the United States. And he is whereas Goldziher is really looking at the metin of the hadith, the content of the hadith, to tell you when it's made up. What agenda is this hadith advancing? That tells you when it was made up. For Schacht, he looks at the isnad as well. So, yes, we already saw you. Thank you. Okay, here's... Oh, look, you even have a green line that has been preserved for you. Wonderful. So this is... Schacht looks at the isnad. And what he says is, he mostly relied on the 6 books. He relied on the of a Shafi'i. Shafi'i's sort of compiled writings by his student Rabi' bin Sulaiman al-Muradi. And he looks at the hadiths dealing with legal issues. And what he says is, if we collect the different narrations of a hadith, what we find is that the prophet is attributed to a prophet, then a companion, then a successor, and then let's say at some point you get this, what he calls the common link. And if you look at all the isnads, you kind of create an isnad tree. What you see is that it's after this common link that it really spreads out. So what he says is, our assumption is that this common link is the person who actually originated this hadith. They made it up, they attributed it to the prophet. Because if it had existed earlier, it would have been transmitted more widely. We would have all these other, isnads going out from the companion, from the successor. So what Schacht also does is this is a way you can figure out when this appeared. It appeared with this figure, this common link. What he finds is, if you look, let's say, at the Muwatta of Malik, Imam Malik, died 179, 795, 796. You find a hadith, or a report, that is attributed to a successor. Someone like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, died around 93 Hijri, the son-in-law of Abu Hurairah. And then you look in the of the Shafi'i. Shafi'i is Malik's student, died 820 of the Common Era. And you find this same report, this time it's attributed to a companion. Let's say it's attributed to Abu Hurairah. And then you look in Sahih al-Bukhari. Bukhari is 2 people away from Shafi'i. 2 people away from Malik. Or actually, sometimes 1 person away from Malik. Often 1 person. And you find the same hadith, and it's attributed to the Prophet. So what Schacht says is that this is back growth of the isnad. The isnad is growing backwards as time goes on. And what he says is, in the early Islamic period, the time of the companions, the time of the successors, between the let's say the beginning of the Second Civil War in 680 and the late 700s, that Islamic law is actually local law. Islam is actually these different local schools, Medina, of Kufa, of Basra. Everybody has their, there's no notion that Sunnah of the Prophet is something that unifies them all. They just have their local schools, the Kufans and the Basrans and the Medinans. Now what happens is, they're all competing with each other. So the Kufan says, I think the correct position on drinking Nabid is this, and the Basran says, I think it's that. How do they beat each other over the head with evidence? What evidence do they can find? Well, successor says this. Sa'id al-Musayyib says this. Support me. And then the Basran says, oh yeah? Well, look what I have. It's actually a companion in my book who says this. And then eventually, his argument is that Imam al-Shafi'i comes along in the late 700s and makes the Prophet Muhammad the source that everybody has to go to. He's sort of the ultimate trump card, is the Prophet. And his argument is that since, if you look at the 6 books, these are the majority, vast majority of their contents are hadiths from the Prophet that go back to the Prophet. They must originate after the time of the Shafi'i in the late 700s. So it's really in the late 700s to the early 800s that the world of hadith that Sunni Muslims know and love is created. It's created as a back projection of what was originally actually local schools of law, opinions of successors, that gets pushed back first to the companions and then to the Prophet. So his argument is that if you come across if you see something attributed to a successor, it is more historically accurate and earlier than something that's attributed to a companion, and more historically accurate and earlier than something attributed to the Prophet. Is this clear? Have I lost anybody? Yes.
Looking at early Islam, we understand that Islam spread quite rapidly around the world. You know, we went to India, we went to North Africa, etc., etc., and therefore many of the companions even as far as, for example, Cyprus. Isn't it perfectly conceivable? Also, sometimes certain companions had ijazah and ijazah, so for certain hadiths it was transmitted to them, but it wouldn't be for the lay people. Examples of which Abu Hurairah, I'm paraphrasing here, is I have 2 pots of knowledge. If I was to reveal one pot, I reveal one pot, another pot if I reveal the top of my head. That's just a paraphrasing thing. So isn't it conceivable that hadiths that came centuries later were probably around at the time of the Prophet ﷺ, but they were given to certain people?
That's a very good point. These are they're locally limited. Okay, that's an important point, which will be brought to bear on Schacht. Because Schacht's, an important assumption here, is very important, is the idea of an argument e silentio, or out of silence. I think I wrote that down somewhere. It's not on this slide. It should be. E silentio. Sometimes you can get a little pen, and I will write in terrible handwriting. Students love this when I do it. It's like an Etch-a-Sketch. I don't know if you have those in England. Argument from silence. Absence of evidence is evidence of absence. Or as former U.S. Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Which is actually correct from an Islamic perspective. Donald Rumsfeld, not good ideas, but sometimes pearls of wisdom. My wife always gets angry when I say that. But the argument is, if you don't have it, if in fact Malik is this Muslim scholar, he should want to create the strongest argument possible for his position. If he only includes a successor opinion in his book, and not a prophetic hadith of the same content, it must mean that the prophetic hadith didn't exist, because if it did, he would have included it. That's the argument in silencio. As you've said, there are numerous reasons why this might not be there. And this is something that is then, it's a criticism of his work. A good criticism. But that's the argument. This is absolutely core for his argument. Because the backgrowth of isnads is based on the idea that originally it was not a prophetic hadith. There was no prophetic hadith. And that it gets pushed back farther and farther to more and more powerful sources of legitimacy until it ends up with the ultimate source of legitimacy, which is the Prophet. Now, of importance...
We'll stop the questions, because I think, like with this question, it's going to be answered later.
Yeah.
How long will Juynboll take?
I'm just going to be very quick.
That's fine. Then we'll have
Very
to
quick.
take a break after Juynboll.
So, Juynboll, G.H.A. Juynboll is a Dutch scholar who died about a year and a half ago. He's a very interesting fellow. His family, actually, the Juynboll family was a merchant family that was involved in Dutch East India Company and Dutch colonial activities in Southeast Asia. And some of his relatives, the previous generation and the previous generation, were leading scholars of Islam in Southeast Asia. So he comes from a family, really, that proves both, sort of the Orientalist, sort of an Orientalist tradition of studying Islam, but it's also linked to colonial activities. It's very important. So he did a tremendous number of studies of hadith, and he really builds on Schacht's methods and kind of, yes, we saw you already, and you. Here we go. So here he really kind of elaborates Schacht's methods more and creates a new jargon for discussing them. So what his argument is, again, the common link is here we go. The common link is the person who makes up the hadith. His argument is Muslims love hadith. They're always talking about hadiths. They're always talking about how you should listen to the Prophet. They're always talking about how many gazillions of people went and attended the hadith circles of Sufyan ibn Uyayna or Shu'b ibn al-Hajjaj in Basra. Hundreds, thousands of people there attending these lessons, hearing hadiths. If really this was happening, you'd have dozens of people transmitting these hadiths. If you don't have them, then means these hadiths must not have been transmitted. His argument is that if you go back and you construct isnad trees based on hadith collections, those moments of contact, of connection, that are testified to or established by numerous transmissions from that source, those are historically reliable moments of transmission. You can say this happened. The hadith existed. This person actually said this. If you don't have these numerous transmissions from a supposed source, since Muslims are obsessed with hadith and they love attending these sessions and listening and transmitting, if it doesn't happen, then it must not have happened. The hadith didn't exist. So, where are all the people from this companion? Where are all the people who are supposedly transmitting this from the successor? They didn't exist. The hadith wasn't around. This guy made it up. How do we know that? Because we have these other sources. And he talks about partial common links who are figures who transmit the material from that original source. But if we look at hadith collections, let's say Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan of Abu Dawood, we find there's other material as well. We see, let's say, in the Mu'jam of al-Tabarani, Mu'jam al-Kabir of al-Tabarani, died 360, 971. Abu Qasim al-Tabarani from Isfahan, originally from Tiberias on the Galilee Sea, moves to Isfahan for 60 years and learns 3 words of Persian. Just enough to order out. So, he said, he didn't know very much Persian. This is a mark of pride because he never really got involved in non-Arabic things, enough to say hello and things like that. So, you find an isnad in, let's say, Tabarani's. It doesn't go by this route, by this common link. How do we explain this? Now, according to Juynboll's method and Schacht's method, is this a historically reliable? Is this a historically reliable transmission? Does anyone have an answer for that?
No.
Why not?
You don't have the numerous transmissions.
Exactly. This is just made up, because if it were real, you'd have all these people coming out of this transmitter and this transmitter. So this guy made it up. Why did he make it up? He wants his own isnad. He wants a shorter isnad. Or he wants to help in this great conspiracy to make this hadith seem more reliable. He calls this a dive isnad, that kind of dives in around the side. And sometimes you'll have a hadith that doesn't have a common link. It's just a bunch of single strands. He calls those spiders. And those for him are not, you can't establish them as existing at any time, basically, until the collection in which they're found. Now, a very important position of Juynboll. Okay. Is that, and it's implicit in Schacht, it's explicit in Juynboll, is that, in effect, all hadiths are made up. I mean, you know, you can, if this is your criteria, if these are your criteria for determining when a hadith enters circulation, that it happens with a common link. And if the common link is always someone who's, let's say, a successor or beyond. For Juynboll, he says that these people usually exist in the early, 700 to 720, 700 to 730 of the Common Era. This is when hadiths are made up. There are no, in effect, there are no reliably authentic hadiths of the Prophet. And he has an article on the famous hadith of Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar. Whoever lies about me, misrepresents me intentionally, let him prepare for himself a seat in hellfire. He has an article on this in which he shows, according to his methodology, that it cannot be established as going back to the Prophet. So if this hadith, which is for Muslims the most authentic hadith, between 60 and 100 companions transmitted. Tabarani has a whole book on the people who transmit this hadith. If this is not reliable, then nothing is. There is no reliably establishable hadith of the Prophet. So what you have, what the hadith tradition is a gigantic conspiracy. Muir had been critical. He says, he looks at Bukhari and he says a third to a half of this book is nonsense. But the rest is, the Prophet had to say something. And it's generally reliable. With Gold's here, you have skepticism. You have a hadith, if it seems to support some agenda, you take it out. That's something made up later. But this idea implicit in Schacht, explicit in Juynboll, is that nothing in the hadith tradition is really representative of something the Prophet actually said. Okay, I will end there. We'll start next time.
Yeah, we'll just take a short refreshment break. 10 minutes, please. Having prompt that. Thank you.
Some of these, we're going to do, those who do the registration a bit later, and also I'm going to need every